This was not a case that began with a crime, but with a man who entered a police station late in the evening and calmly described an event that had not yet taken place. There was no urgency in his manner, no visible tension, and no attempt to persuade those who listened that his words required immediate belief. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who was not predicting an outcome, but recalling something already decided, something that had moved beyond the point of uncertainty and into inevitability. Tonight, you return once again to the quiet world of Detective Edmund Blackwood, where the most unsettling mysteries do not arrive with noise or alarm, but with the smallest disturbance in routine. These are not cases that demand haste or force. They unfold through observation, through patience, and through the careful alignment of details that at first appear disconnected. It is within that alignment that truth begins to reveal itself. The man had arrived at an hour when the station had already settled into a slower rhythm. The urgency of the day had passed, and what remained was a steady, subdued continuity. Movement had become measured, conversations quieter, and the atmosphere carried the familiar stillness that accompanies the later hours. It was not a time when events were expected to alter the course of anything. It was a time when routine sustained itself without interruption. He approached the desk without hesitation and waited to be acknowledged, his presence neither intrusive nor uncertain. There was nothing in his appearance that invited suspicion. His posture was composed, his movements deliberate, and his expression remained steady, neither distant nor engaged beyond what the moment required. He did not attempt to draw attention. He did not need to. When he began to speak, he did so with clarity that carried structure rather than emotion. What he described was not fragmented or uncertain. It unfolded in sequence, as though each detail had already been placed in its proper position. A location was identified, a private residence situated within a quiet part of the city. A time was established with exact precision, not approximated but fixed. The interior of a room was described with calm accuracy, including the arrangement of objects and the position in which a man would later be found. The act itself was outlined without emphasis, not dramatized, not softened, but presented as part of a sequence that had already taken form. There was no urgency in the description because urgency belongs to uncertainty, and nothing in his manner suggested uncertainty. When the explanation ended, the man remained still, as though the purpose of his presence had already been fulfilled. The officer who had listened found no immediate framework within which to place what had been described. The details were too complete to be dismissed entirely, yet they referred to something that did not yet exist. There was no report to match them, no event to confirm them, and no visible reason to treat them as anything other than an unusual statement delivered with unusual calm. Questions were asked as routine required, and the man's responses aligned with the same steady composure. His identity was provided without hesitation. His answers did not contradict themselves. There was no sign of agitation, no indication that he was attempting to provoke or mislead. He did not insist upon belief, nor did he attempt to withdraw what he had already said. He simply maintained the same quiet certainty with which he had arrived. Within the structure of the station, there was no clear justification to detain him. No crime had occurred. No direct threat had been made. The law requires action before it intervenes, and here there had been only description, precise but unverified. The absence of immediate evidence preserved the ordinary course of procedure. He was allowed to leave. The station returned to its quiet continuity. Reports were completed, the details of the encounter recorded and set aside within the larger flow of routine. Conversations resumed, movement continued, and the presence of the man became, for a time, no more than a minor deviation within an otherwise undisturbed night. Yet routine, once altered even slightly, does not entirely forget the change. It carries it forward, quietly, until the moment when its meaning can no longer be ignored. At precisely 14 minutes past 2 the following morning, the event he had described took place. The location corresponded exactly. The interior of the room matched the arrangement that had been outlined. The man was found in the position that had been described with such calm precision. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of disturbance beyond the act itself, and no immediate explanation for how the event had occurred. The structure of the description and the structure of the event aligned without deviation. By the time this alignment was fully recognized, the man who had first described it had already disappeared back into the ordinary movement of the city. His presence no longer stood out. It had dissolved into the same continuity that had once allowed him to enter unnoticed. When the report eventually reached Blackwood, he did not begin with the crime itself. The crime, though precise, was only the visible result. What mattered was the structure that had made it possible. He began instead with the man, because in a case such as this, the explanation cannot remain suspended between impossibility and chance. Either the man had encountered knowledge that should not exist, or he had understood the present with such completeness that what followed could unfold in no other way. And it is within that distinction that the quiet work of truth begins. There are moments when an event does not disturb reality through what has happened, but through the order in which it is understood. Blackwood recognized that the crime itself, though precise and unsettling, was not the true anomaly. Crimes occur within the structure of the city every day, each shaped by motive, opportunity, and circumstance. What separated this case from all others was not the act, but its sequence. The description had come first. The event had followed. This inversion, quiet and exact, altered the natural rhythm through which events are normally examined. Cause is expected to precede effect. Observation is expected to follow action. Yet here, the structure had been reversed, not through confusion, but through clarity. The man had not speculated. He had not suggested. He had described. Blackwood began, as he always did, not with urgency, but with reconstruction. He reviewed the account of the man's arrival at the station, not as a singular moment, but as part of a larger continuity. The time of his appearance, the manner of his presence, the absence of agitation, all suggested something that did not align with panic or impulse. There had been no visible pressure in his behavior, no indication that he had come to prevent the act he described. His purpose had not been intervention. It had been acknowledgement. This distinction, though subtle, carried significance. A man who fears an event attempts to alter it. A man who understands an event does not. Blackwood allowed this observation to settle before continuing. He examined the structure of the description itself, noting the precision of its elements. The location had not been approximate. The time had not been estimated. The interior had not been generalized. Each detail had existed within a fixed position, forming a sequence that did not require adjustment. Such precision does not emerge from imagination alone. It emerges from familiarity. Familiarity, however, does not extend into the future. It exists within the present, which meant that the man had not been describing what would happen. He had been describing what, under certain conditions, could not fail to happen. Blackwood shifted his attention to the location itself, reconstructing the environment in which the crime had taken place. The residence, as recorded, stood within a quieter district, removed from constant observation. Its structure was typical of its surroundings, neither isolated nor exposed, its routine shaped by the predictable habits of those who lived within it. Nothing in its design suggested vulnerability beyond what exists in any ordinary home. And yet the act had occurred without visible disruption. There had been no forced entry, no sign of struggle, no indication that the sequence had unfolded with resistance. The event had not imposed itself upon the environment. It had aligned with it. Blackwood understood that alignment is never accidental. It is constructed. He returned to the timing of the event, allowing his attention to settle upon its precision. 14 minutes past 2 is not an arbitrary moment. It is a point within the night when routine reaches its lowest visibility. Movement is minimal. Observation is reduced. The structure of the city continues, but without attention. It is a moment when actions can occur without interruption, not because they are concealed, but because they exist within a gap in awareness. A man who selects such a time does not rely on chance. He relies on understanding. Blackwood continued his reconstruction, moving from the event back toward the description, allowing the two to align not as separate occurrences, but as parts of a single structure. The man had not arrived at the station in confusion. He had arrived with clarity. His presence had not been reactive. It had been deliberate, which suggested that the description had not been a warning. It had been a statement of completion. This realization did not introduce urgency. It introduced direction. Blackwood understood now that the question was not whether the man had known the future, but how he had constructed a present in which the future could unfold with certainty. The distinction was essential, not because it simplified the case, but because it returned it to the realm of logic, where explanation could exist without contradiction. He reviewed the man's behavior once more, considering not what had been said, but what had not. There had been no attempt to intervene, no indication of fear, no visible connection to the victim beyond the structure of the description itself. The man had not acted as someone seeking to prevent an outcome. He had acted as someone confirming that it would occur. Confirmation, Blackwood knew, belongs only to those who have already shaped the conditions. He allowed the thought to settle fully before continuing. The case had not begun with a crime. It had begun with control. And control, once established, leaves behind a pattern that can be followed, not forward into uncertainty, but backward into its origin, where the structure that made it possible first took form. There are events that appear sudden only because the conditions that created them remain unseen. Blackwood understood that nothing of this nature emerges without preparation, and preparation, when carried out with sufficient care, does not announce itself as intention. It blends into routine. It becomes part of the ordinary structure of life until the moment when its outcome reveals that it had been present all along. The man who had entered the station had not spoken as someone anticipating a possibility. His description had carried the weight of inevitability, and inevitability does not arise from chance. It arises when conditions have been arranged so precisely that deviation becomes unlikely and outcome becomes the natural conclusion of what has already been set in motion. Blackwood began to examine the event not as a single act, but as the final point in a sequence that must have extended backward in time. The residence where the crime had occurred did not present itself as unusual. Its structure, its placement within the city, and its outward appearance all suggested continuity rather than vulnerability. Yet within that continuity, something had been introduced that altered its internal balance. The absence of forced entry remained the first and most important detail. It removed the possibility of intrusion as a primary mechanism. The act had not required entry through resistance. It had required presence without disruption. This distinction narrowed the field of explanation, not by eliminating possibilities, but by refining them. A man does not move within a space without being noticed unless his presence belongs there. Blackwood allowed this thought to settle before continuing his reconstruction. The interior of the room, as described both before and after the event, had remained largely undisturbed. Objects had retained their position. There had been no visible sign of struggle. The act had occurred within the existing structure of the environment, not against it. This suggested that the sequence had unfolded without interruption and, more importantly, without resistance. Resistance alters space. Its absence preserves it. The timing of the event reinforced this understanding. 14 minutes past 2 existed within a narrow interval in which the surrounding environment entered its lowest state of awareness. The city continued, but its attention diminished. The residents, like many others, would have been enclosed within the quiet rhythm of sleep, where movement becomes infrequent and sound carries differently through stillness. A moment such as this does not create opportunity on its own. It must be recognized. Blackwood understood that recognition of such a moment requires familiarity not only with the environment, but with the routine of those who inhabit it. The man who had described the event had not selected the time arbitrarily. He had selected it because it aligned with conditions that reduced unpredictability. Unpredictability is the only true obstacle to control. Remove it, and outcome becomes manageable. He shifted his attention toward the victim, not as an isolated individual, but as part of a structure of routine. Every life, no matter how varied, follows patterns that can be observed. The hours of rest, the arrangement of the home, the habits that repeat without conscious thought, all of these form a framework within which action can either be resisted or allowed. Blackwood considered the possibility that the victim's routine had been studied, not briefly, but over time. Such study does not require intrusion. It requires proximity. It requires the ability to observe without being observed, to remain present without introducing disruption. A person who exists within the edges of another's life can learn its structure without effort, simply by allowing repetition to reveal itself. This was where preparation begins. Not with action, but with observation. He returned in thought to the man who had entered the station, considering once more the nature of his certainty. There had been no hesitation in the description, no uncertainty in the sequence of events. This level of precision suggested that the conditions had already been set, that nothing remained to be adjusted, and that the outcome no longer depended on choice. Choice introduces variation. Variation introduces risk. The absence of both suggests completion. Blackwood understood now that the crime had not been planned as a singular act, but as the final step in a process that had reduced uncertainty to its minimum. Each element, the location, the timing, the position of the victim, the absence of resistance, had been aligned in advance. The man had not needed to predict the future because he had constructed a present in which the future could follow only one path. He allowed this realization to settle fully, recognizing that the case had already begun to reveal its structure. The man's visit to the station had not been a request for intervention. It had been a declaration that the sequence had reached its final stage. There had been nothing left to adjust, nothing left to prevent, and nothing left to alter. The event had not been waiting to happen. It had already been made inevitable. Blackwood understood that the next step would not be to search for what had occurred within the room, but to trace the quiet sequence that had led to it. Preparation leaves no visible mark at the moment of completion, but it always leaves a pattern when observed across time. And it is within that pattern that the origin of control can be found. There are routines that exist so quietly within a life that they are never recognized as structure, only as habit. They form without intention, repeat without resistance, and continue without examination. Blackwood understood that if the crime had been made inevitable, then it had not been forced into existence, but guided into it through such routine. Guidance, when applied with patience, leaves no visible trace at the moment it takes effect. It alters conditions gradually until what occurs appears natural, even expected. He began to examine the victim not as the subject of an isolated event, but as the center of a repeating pattern. Every detail of a person's life, when observed over time, reveals consistency. The hour at which lights are extinguished, the arrangement of objects within reach, the position in which rest is taken, the paths followed through familiar spaces, all of these create a framework within which movement becomes predictable. Predictability is not weakness. It is simply structure. And structure, once understood, can be influenced. Blackwood reviewed the available information concerning the residence and its occupant, allowing each detail to settle into its place within a broader continuity. There had been no sign of intrusion, which suggested that entry had not been achieved through force. The absence of disturbance within the room suggested that the act had not been resisted. The precision of the timing suggested that the moment had been selected not only for its stillness, but for its alignment with the victim's routine. A person does not resist what they do not recognize as threat. Blackwood allowed this thought to remain before continuing. The event had not unfolded as an interruption. It had unfolded as continuation. Whatever had occurred within that room had done so without introducing alarm, without altering the immediate environment, and without triggering the kind of reaction that would leave visible evidence behind. This could not be achieved through sudden action. It required preparation that extended beyond the moment itself. He considered the possibility that the victim's routine had not only been observed, but gradually adjusted. Such adjustment does not require direct confrontation. It can be introduced through small, almost imperceptible changes, objects placed slightly differently, habits encouraged in subtle ways, expectations formed over time. A door that is usually locked might, over weeks, be left unsecured. A pattern of movement might be influenced by repetition until it becomes automatic. Control, when applied with patience, does not impose itself. It becomes accepted. Blackwood returned to the timing once more, not as an isolated detail, but as part of the larger pattern. 14 minutes past 2 was not simply a quiet moment. It was a moment within the victim's routine that could be relied upon. It suggested that the individual would be in a specific place, in a specific state, with a specific level of awareness. Such certainty cannot be assumed. It must be confirmed, which meant that the man who had described the event had not relied on a single observation, but on repeated ones. He had not guessed the conditions. He had studied them until they no longer required confirmation. Blackwood allowed his attention to shift briefly to the nature of the act itself, not in terms of its outcome, but in terms of its execution. The absence of struggle suggested that the victim had not perceived the moment as threatening until it was too late to respond. This implied proximity, familiarity, or a circumstance that prevented recognition of danger. Familiarity does not alert. It reassures. A presence that belongs within a space does not trigger resistance. It moves within the environment as part of its accepted structure. A person who has been seen before, who has existed within the edges of routine, can approach without creating alarm. Blackwood understood now that the man had not simply created the conditions for the act. He had become part of them. This realization did not introduce urgency. It introduced clarity. The case was no longer defined by the impossibility of prediction, but by the precision of preparation. The man had not needed to foresee the future because he had shaped the present with such care that the future could not deviate from its path. He considered again the man's visit to the station, recognizing it now as part of the same structure. It had not been an act of uncertainty. It had been an act of completion. The sequence had already been arranged. The conditions had already been aligned. What remained was not to decide whether the event would occur, but simply to allow it to unfold. Blackwood remained still for a moment, allowing the full weight of this understanding to settle into place. The crime had not been committed in the traditional sense. It had been constructed, piece by piece, within the quiet framework of routine, until its outcome became inevitable. Routine had not failed. It had been used. And somewhere within that structure, there remained a trace, not of the act itself, but of the process that had made it possible. There are presences that exist within a life so naturally that they are never examined. They do not arrive as interruption, nor do they announce themselves as change. They become part of the environment, accepted without effort, repeated without thought, and trusted without verification. Blackwood understood that if the conditions of the crime had been shaped over time, then the person responsible had not remained outside the victim's life. He had existed within it, close enough to observe, and close enough to influence without being noticed. Observation alone does not create control. It must be accompanied by acceptance. Blackwood turned his attention toward the nature of familiarity, allowing the structure of the case to guide his reasoning. The absence of forced entry had already established that the act had not begun with intrusion. The absence of resistance had suggested that the moment had not been recognized as danger. These two conditions, when combined, did not point toward a stranger. They pointed toward someone whose presence had already been integrated into routine. Integration does not occur quickly. It develops through repetition. A person who appears once may be remembered. A person who appears often becomes expected. And expectation removes the need for scrutiny. The mind no longer evaluates what it has already accepted. It allows it to continue. Blackwood considered how such acceptance might have been established. It did not require deception in its early stages. It required consistency, a presence that returns at similar times, that behaves within expected limits, that does not disrupt the structure of daily life, gradually becomes part of that structure. Doors open more easily. Movements are no longer questioned. The environment adjusts itself to include what was once external. He returned again to the victim's routine, not as a sequence of isolated habits, but as a framework within which another presence could exist. There would have been moments of contact, brief, ordinary interactions that left no lasting impression, conversations that did not require memory, visits that did not require explanation. Over time, these moments would have formed a pattern, one that allowed proximity without suspicion. Proximity creates opportunity. Opportunity, when combined with patience, creates control. Blackwood allowed this line of thought to settle before continuing. The man who had entered the station had spoken with certainty not because he had imagined the event, but because he had already completed the most important part of it. He had established presence. He had removed unpredictability. He had reduced the unknown to a manageable sequence. What remained had not required force. It had required timing. Blackwood considered how easily a familiar presence could move within a space without altering it. Doors need not be forced if they are opened willingly. Movement need not be concealed if it appears natural. A person who belongs within an environment does not disturb it. He becomes part of its continuity. Continuity, however, can be shaped. A habit introduced gradually becomes expectation. A small change repeated often becomes standard. Over time, what was once unfamiliar becomes accepted without thought. A door left slightly ajar becomes the norm. A routine adjusted by minutes becomes fixed. The environment adapts, not through resistance, but through quiet accommodation. Blackwood understood that this process had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, though not obvious. The man had not imposed change suddenly. He had introduced it slowly, allowing each adjustment to settle before introducing the next. By the time the sequence was complete, the environment itself had been altered, not visibly, but structurally. The victim's routine had not been broken. It had been redirected. This distinction carried significance. A broken routine draws attention. A redirected one continues without question. The victim would not have recognized the change because it had occurred within the limits of normal variation. A few minutes earlier, a door handled differently, a presence appearing more frequently. None of these would have been enough to trigger suspicion on their own. Together, they created certainty. Blackwood returned once more to the moment described in the report, not as an isolated act, but as the final point in a sequence of accepted movements. The victim had been where he was expected to be. The environment had been arranged as it had been shaped to be. The presence that entered had not been resisted because it had not been recognized as threat. Recognition requires difference. There had been none. Blackwood allowed the conclusion to settle with quiet clarity. The man had not simply observed the routine. He had become part of it. And in doing so, he had gained the one advantage that no system can defend against: the ability to act without being seen as acting at all. What remained now was not to prove that such a presence had existed, but to understand how it had been established, how long it had been maintained, and how it had been used to guide the sequence toward its inevitable conclusion. There are patterns that never present themselves as patterns while they are forming. They exist within the quiet repetition of ordinary life, where each individual moment appears too small to carry meaning on its own. Blackwood understood that the presence he had begun to trace would not be revealed through a single observation, but through accumulation. It would exist not in what had happened once, but in what had happened often enough to become invisible. He turned his attention to the span of time preceding the event, allowing the sequence to extend backward beyond the moment of inevitability. The crime had not begun at 14 minutes past 2. It had not begun on the night it occurred. It had begun earlier, within the unnoticed alignment of repeated interactions, each one too ordinary to attract attention, yet together forming a structure that could not be dismissed. Repetition, when uninterrupted, becomes expectation, and expectation removes the need to observe. Blackwood considered how a presence becomes established within the boundaries of another person's life. It does not require permission in a formal sense. It requires consistency. A face seen regularly ceases to be evaluated. A voice heard often ceases to be questioned. A movement repeated frequently becomes part of the environment itself. The victim's life, like any other, would have contained such repetitions. There would have been familiar encounters, predictable exchanges, moments that did not require memory because they carried no immediate consequence. It was within these moments that the pattern had formed, not as something imposed, but as something allowed. Blackwood understood that allowance is the most subtle form of control. The person does not resist what appears natural. He reconstructed the likely structure of these interactions, not through speculation, but through alignment with known behavior. The presence would have appeared at times that did not disrupt routine. It would have remained within acceptable limits of duration and proximity. It would not have introduced urgency or demand. It would have existed quietly, reinforcing its own acceptance through repetition. Such a presence does not need to conceal itself. It simply does not stand out. Over time, this absence of distinction becomes its greatest strength. The mind no longer registers what it has already accepted. It filters it out, allowing attention to focus only on what differs from expectation. In this way, the presence becomes both visible and unseen, existing within the environment without ever being examined. Blackwood allowed this understanding to settle before continuing. The pattern, once established, would not remain static. It would evolve, though gradually, and always within the limits of what could be accepted without question. A slightly longer visit, a slightly different time of arrival, a small change in the arrangement of space. Each adjustment would be introduced with care, allowing it to settle before the next was made. Change, when introduced slowly, is rarely recognized as change. It becomes the new form of continuity. Blackwood returned to the structure of the residence itself, considering how such gradual adjustments might have altered its internal routine. The positioning of objects, the handling of doors, the sequence of movement through rooms, all of these could be influenced over time without drawing attention. A pattern of behavior, once established, does not need to be enforced. It sustains itself. This was where the process revealed its precision. The man had not needed to control every variable. He had needed only to reduce variability to a minimum. By shaping the environment and the routine together, he had created a sequence in which deviation became unlikely. The outcome did not depend on a single action, but on the alignment of many small ones, each reinforcing the next. Blackwood considered again the absence of resistance at the moment of the act. It was not simply that the victim had not resisted. It was that the situation had not presented itself as one requiring resistance. The presence that entered had not disrupted expectation. It had fulfilled it. Fulfillment does not trigger alarm. It confirms safety. This confirmation had been the final condition required for inevitability. Once the presence had been accepted completely, once the routine had been shaped to accommodate it, the act itself required no force. It could occur within the existing structure without altering it in any visible way. Blackwood allowed the full sequence to take form within his thoughts. The pattern had begun quietly, formed through repetition, and evolved through gradual adjustment. It had not drawn attention because it had not introduced difference. By the time the final moment arrived, the structure was complete. The future had not been predicted. It had been constructed. He remained still for a moment, recognizing that the case had moved beyond uncertainty. The presence that had shaped the routine would leave traces, not in the form of evidence within the room, but in the pattern of time that surrounded it. The question was no longer whether such a presence existed. It was how clearly it could now be seen when examined without the filter of familiarity. And once seen, It could no longer remain invisible. There are elements within any routine that remain so consistent they are rarely questioned. Time is the most reliable of these. It does not depend on intention, and it does not alter itself without cause. Blackwood understood that if the event had occurred with such precision, then time itself had been used not as a variable, but as a fixed point around which everything else had been arranged. He returned his attention to the specific moment described in the report. 14 minutes past 2 was not an approximation, nor was it a convenient estimate. It was exact. The man who had entered the station had not described a range or a possibility. He had identified a point in time with such clarity that it suggested repetition rather than prediction. Repetition creates certainty. Certainty removes the need to guess. Blackwood considered how such precision might have been achieved. A single observation cannot establish a fixed moment. It can suggest a tendency, but it cannot confirm consistency. To know that an event would occur at a specific minute requires knowledge built over time, through repeated alignment of observation and outcome. This suggested that the moment had not been chosen arbitrarily. It had been discovered. Blackwood allowed this distinction to settle before continuing. If the victim's routine had included a consistent point at which awareness diminished, whether through rest, habit, or environmental conditions, then that moment would become predictable. Predictability, once confirmed, becomes a point of control. Control does not require force when timing is precise. He began to reconstruct the likely structure of the victim's nightly routine. There would have been a sequence that repeated with quiet regularity. The preparation for rest, the movement through familiar spaces, the final actions before stillness. These steps, once repeated enough times, would form a pattern that could be observed without interruption. Within that pattern, there would be a moment when attention ceased, a moment when awareness gave way to rest, a moment when the environment remained unchanged, but the capacity to respond diminished. This moment, once identified, would not shift easily. Human routines, especially those connected to rest, tend toward consistency. The body follows its own rhythm, and that rhythm, when uninterrupted, creates stability. Stability creates opportunity. Blackwood understood now that the man had not imposed the time upon the situation. He had found it, and once found, he had aligned everything else around it. He considered how such alignment might have been achieved. The presence that had already been established within the victim's routine would have allowed continued observation without suspicion. Each night would provide confirmation. Each repetition would reduce uncertainty. Over time, the exact moment would no longer need to be measured. It would be known. Knowledge of this kind does not remain abstract. It becomes actionable. Blackwood returned to the man's statement, recognizing now that its precision had not been an expression of confidence, but of verification. The time had not been chosen because it seemed likely. It had been stated because it had already proven consistent. This was not prediction. It was confirmation of pattern. He allowed his thoughts to extend further, considering how the surrounding environment might have reinforced this consistency. The absence of external disturbance, the stability of the residence, and the isolation of the moment within the broader structure of the night all contributed to maintaining the fixed point. Nothing had interfered with the pattern. Nothing had introduced variation. Variation is the only threat to certainty. Its absence ensures repetition. Blackwood understood that once the time had been established as fixed, the remaining elements could be arranged around it with precision. The presence, already accepted, could be introduced at the exact moment required. The environment, already shaped, would respond without resistance. The sequence, once initiated, would unfold without deviation. The act itself had not required speed. It had required synchronization. Synchronization aligns action with condition. Condition, once stabilized, guarantees outcome. Blackwood remained still for a moment, recognizing that the case had revealed another layer of its structure. The man had not controlled time. He had recognized its consistency and used it as the foundation for everything that followed. By anchoring the sequence to a moment that did not change, he had removed the greatest source of unpredictability. The future had not been uncertain. It had been scheduled. And once scheduled within a structure that did not vary, it could be described with the same certainty as something that had already occurred. What remained now was to understand how the final alignment had been achieved, how presence, routine, and time had been brought together into a single sequence that required no adjustment and left no room for deviation. Because when all variables are removed, what remains is not possibility. It is inevitability. There are moments in any carefully constructed pattern when the need for correction disappears entirely. Blackwood understood that the most precise systems are not those that require constant intervention, but those that, once established, sustain themselves without effort. The crime he examined did not bear the marks of something adjusted in motion. It bore the quiet consistency of something that had already reached completion before the final moment arrived. He returned his attention to the alignment of elements that had defined the event. Time had remained fixed. Routine had been shaped into predictability. Presence had been established without resistance. None of these existed in isolation. Together, they formed a sequence that no longer required control at the moment of execution. Control, when perfect, becomes invisible. Blackwood considered how such a sequence might have been assembled without introducing disturbance. Each element must have been placed gradually, allowed to settle into its position before the next was introduced. The process would not have been marked by sudden change, but by quiet refinement. A routine adjusted slightly. A habit reinforced through repetition. A presence normalized through familiarity. These adjustments, taken individually, would not have altered perception. Taken together, they would have removed uncertainty. He allowed the structure of this understanding to expand. The man who had entered the station had not needed to return to the residence repeatedly at irregular times. Irregularity invites attention. Instead, his presence would have aligned with what was already expected. His movements would have followed established paths. His actions would have appeared as continuation rather than deviation. Continuation does not require explanation. It simply persists. Blackwood turned again to the interior of the room, not to search for evidence, but to understand how it had remained undisturbed. The absence of disruption suggested that the sequence had unfolded within the limits of expectation. Nothing had been moved in a way that would attract notice. Nothing had been introduced that would alter the environment abruptly. The space had received the act as though it belonged there. This was not concealment. It was integration. The act had been absorbed into the structure of the room without resistance, because the conditions had already been shaped to accept it. A presence that belongs does not disturb space. It moves within it as part of its design. Blackwood considered the final alignment that had made the act possible. Time had provided the fixed point. Routine had provided the predictable structure. Presence had provided access. When these elements intersect, they create a sequence that no longer depends on decision. Decision introduces hesitation. Hesitation introduces error. The absence of both ensures continuity. He allowed this realization to settle before continuing. The man had not acted impulsively. He had not relied on timing alone. He had ensured that when the moment arrived, there would be nothing left to decide. The act would not be a choice. It would be the completion of a sequence already set in motion. This was why the description had carried such certainty. It had not described an intention. It had described a result. Blackwood returned in thought to the man's presence at the station, recognizing it now as part of the same completed structure. The visit had not altered the sequence. It had not delayed it. It had not introduced uncertainty. It had existed alongside the process, separate from it, as though the man had stepped briefly outside the pattern he had created, only to acknowledge it. Acknowledgement does not change outcome. It confirms it. Blackwood understood that the case had now reached a point where the mechanics of the act were no longer in question. The sequence had been constructed with such care that it required no correction. The absence of adjustment had been its defining characteristic. Everything had occurred as it had been arranged to occur. The question that remained was no longer how the act had been carried out. It was why the man had chosen to reveal it before it took place. This question did not belong to the structure of the sequence. It belonged to the structure of intention. Blackwood allowed the thought to remain without immediate resolution. Intention, unlike routine, does not always reveal itself through repetition. It often exists beneath the surface of action, shaping it without appearing within it. To understand why the man had spoken, he would need to move beyond the mechanics of the event and examine the purpose that lay behind it. Because a sequence, no matter how perfect, does not explain itself. It is the intention that created it that gives it meaning. And somewhere within that intention, there remained a detail not yet aligned, a quiet element that had not been fully revealed, and which, once understood, would complete the structure of the case. There are structures that can conceal action, and there are others that cannot conceal purpose. Blackwood understood that the sequence he had reconstructed had reached a level of precision that explained how the event had occurred, but not why it had been revealed in advance. The man's presence at the station did not belong to necessity. It did not assist the act, nor did it protect it. It existed outside the mechanics of the sequence, and therefore it belonged to intention. Intention does not always announce itself through emotion. It often reveals itself through deviation. Blackwood returned his attention to that single, quiet deviation, the act of speaking before the event had taken place. The man had not needed to describe what would happen. The sequence, once complete, would unfold without interference. Nothing in his statement had improved the conditions. Nothing had altered the outcome. The act would have occurred regardless, which meant the description had not been functional. It had been deliberate. Blackwood allowed this distinction to settle before continuing. A deliberate act that serves no practical function within a plan must serve a purpose beyond it. It must create an effect not in the event itself, but in how the event is perceived once it occurs. Perception, when shaped carefully, can alter interpretation. And interpretation determines conclusion. Blackwood considered the immediate consequence of the man's statement. When the crime occurred, it was not received as an isolated act. It was received as a confirmation of something that had already been described. The sequence did not appear as a single event, but as part of a larger, unexplained structure. The description had altered the framework through which the act was understood. Instead of asking who had done it, the question had become how it had been known. This shift carried weight. A case that focuses on impossibility moves away from logic. It introduces doubt into the structure of reasoning. It redirects attention from cause to explanation, from evidence to interpretation. In doing so, it creates distance between the act and the person responsible for it. Distance obscures responsibility. Blackwood understood now that the man's intention had not been to predict the future. It had been to distort the present. By introducing the idea of foreknowledge, he had altered the path of investigation. The focus would not remain on routine, familiarity, and preparation. It would move toward the unusual, the unexplained, and the improbable. In this way, the most direct explanation would become the least considered. Simplicity, when surrounded by complexity, becomes invisible. Blackwood allowed this realization to expand. The man had constructed not only the sequence of the act, but also the narrative that would follow it. He had ensured that when the crime occurred, it would not be examined in isolation. It would be connected to his earlier statement, and in that connection, it would acquire a different meaning. Meaning shapes attention. Attention determines direction. By shifting attention away from the structure of routine and toward the question of how the event had been known in advance, the man had created a layer of distraction. Investigators would search for explanations that extended beyond ordinary logic. They would consider possibilities that did not belong to the case. And in doing so, they would move further from the origin of the act itself. Blackwood remained still, allowing the quiet precision of this understanding to settle fully into place. The man had not revealed the crime because he needed to. He had revealed it because it served a purpose. The purpose had been to control perception. Control of perception is not as visible as control of action, but it is often more effective. Blackwood considered once more the calm manner in which the man had spoken. There had been no urgency, no attempt to persuade, no insistence on belief. This absence of force had reinforced the effect. The statement had not been presented as something that demanded attention. It had been presented as something that would later demand explanation. Explanation invites speculation. Speculation weakens certainty. Blackwood understood now that the case had been shaped on two levels. The first had been the construction of inevitability within the physical world. The second had been the construction of uncertainty within the intellectual one. The man had ensured that even after the act had been completed, its meaning would remain unsettled. This was the final layer of control. Not over what would happen, but over how it would be understood. Blackwood allowed the thought to settle before continuing. The structure of the case was now complete in its form, but not yet in its resolution. The sequence had been revealed. The intention had been identified. What remained was to bring these elements together, to remove the distortion that had been introduced, and to return the case to the clarity it had been designed to avoid. Because intention, no matter how carefully concealed, cannot remain separate from the structure that reveals it. And once seen clearly, it no longer has the power to mislead. There are moments in any investigation when attention must return, with renewed clarity, to the point where everything appears to end. Blackwood understood that the structure he had uncovered could not be complete without examining the victim once more, not as the subject of the act, but as a necessary element within the sequence that had made the act inevitable. The man who had described the crime had constructed the conditions, but those conditions had required a response, or rather, the absence of one. Absence of response is never accidental. It belongs to expectation. Blackwood considered the victim not in isolation, but as part of a pattern that had been observed and shaped over time. His routine had provided the structure within which the act could occur, but more importantly, his trust had provided the environment in which it could proceed without resistance. Trust does not reveal itself through words. It reveals itself through behavior, through the quiet acceptance of presence without scrutiny. A person who trusts does not question what has already been accepted. Blackwood allowed this understanding to guide his reasoning further. The victim's life would have contained repetition not only in movement, but in relationship. There would have been individuals whose presence did not require explanation, whose arrival did not disrupt expectation, and whose proximity did not introduce concern. Such individuals exist at the edges of routine, integrated without effort, acknowledged without attention. Within this structure, the victim's role became clearer. He had not simply been observed. He had been relied upon. Reliance is the foundation of predictability. Blackwood returned to the moment of the act, considering it not as an interruption, but as the continuation of a pattern the victim himself had helped sustain. His routine had placed him in the correct position. His trust had removed the need for resistance. His acceptance of familiarity had allowed the final condition to exist without conflict. The sequence had not been forced upon him. It had been completed through him. This distinction carried quiet significance. The man who had constructed the event had not needed to overcome the victim. He had needed only to ensure that the victim would behave as expected. Behavior, once repeated often enough, becomes automatic. It no longer requires conscious decision. It follows its own established path. Blackwood understood that the victim's final moments had not been defined by struggle, but by continuation. The presence that entered the room had not been perceived as a disruption. It had been received as part of the existing structure. This reception had allowed the sequence to unfold without alteration. Alteration introduces resistance. Resistance creates evidence. Its absence preserves inevitability. Blackwood allowed his thoughts to settle before continuing. The man who had entered the station had relied not only on his own preparation, but on the consistency of another person's behavior. This reliance was not uncertain. It had been confirmed through repetition. Each observation of the victim's routine had reduced variability. Each confirmation had strengthened the structure. Over time, the victim's role had become fixed. Not through intention, but through habit. Blackwood considered how easily such a role could be established without awareness. A person does not recognize the predictability of their own actions because those actions feel natural. They do not perceive repetition as limitation. They perceive it as stability. Stability, however, can be observed from the outside with clarity that is not available from within. This difference in perspective creates opportunity. Blackwood returned once more to the broader structure of the case. The sequence had been constructed through routine, timing, and presence. The intention had shaped perception. And the victim, through his own consistency, had provided the final condition necessary for completion. Nothing in this structure required force. Nothing required improvisation. Everything had aligned. He remained still for a moment, recognizing that the case had reached a point where its components no longer existed separately. The man who had described the crime, the routine that had been shaped, and the victim who had completed the sequence all belonged to the same structure. Each had played a role, whether consciously or not, in bringing the event to its inevitable conclusion. The future had not been uncertain. It had been dependent on conditions that had already been met. Blackwood understood now that what remained was not to uncover new elements, but to remove the distortion that had been introduced by the man's statement. The case had been made to appear complex, but its structure was precise. It had been designed to lead attention away from simplicity, away from the quiet alignment of routine and familiarity. To resolve it, that simplicity would need to be restored, because once the structure is seen clearly, there is nothing left to conceal. Only the truth remains, waiting to be understood as it has always been. There are systems that appear complex only because their variables remain unexamined. Blackwood understood that the sequence he had been reconstructing did not rely on an excess of factors, but on their careful reduction. The man had not created uncertainty. He had eliminated it, step by step, until what remained could unfold without deviation. Elimination does not announce itself. It occurs within the ordinary structure of routine. Blackwood turned his attention to the elements that had not appeared in the case, recognizing that absence often reveals more than presence. There had been no sign of forced entry, no evidence of interruption, no witness who had observed anything unusual, no deviation in the victim's routine that would suggest unpredictability. Each of these absences represented not a lack of information, but a removal of variables. A variable, once removed, cannot interfere. Blackwood considered how this process might have been carried out. The presence that had become familiar would have allowed continuous observation, not only of what occurred, but of what could disrupt what occurred. Each potential point of variation would have been identified and reduced. Doors that might be locked unpredictably would be left consistently unsecured. Movements that might shift in timing would be guided into regularity. External influences that might introduce disturbance would be minimized through selection of moment and setting. Selection, when applied with patience, becomes control. He allowed this structure to take form within his thoughts. The man had not needed to manage every detail actively. He had needed only to ensure that nothing remained uncontrolled. Over time, this process would reduce the number of possible outcomes until only one remained viable. Outcome, once isolated, no longer depends on chance. Blackwood returned again to the timing of the act, recognizing it now as the final point within a field that had been cleared of interference. 14 minutes past 2 had not been chosen simply because it was quiet. It had been chosen because it existed at the intersection of multiple absences. The absence of movement, the absence of observation, the absence of resistance. Each of these had been confirmed through repetition. Repetition verifies stability. Stability permits precision. Blackwood considered how the man's understanding of these variables had allowed him to speak with such certainty. There had been no need to account for unexpected change because unexpected change had already been removed from the structure. The sequence did not depend on conditions remaining favorable. It depended on conditions having already been made consistent. Consistency removes uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only source of failure. He allowed this realization to deepen. The man had not predicted an outcome in the traditional sense. He had observed a system from which all alternatives had been gradually eliminated. What remained was not a possibility among many, but the only path available. This was why the description had carried no hesitation. Hesitation belongs to choice. There had been none. Blackwood returned once more to the absence of resistance at the moment of the act. Resistance is itself a variable, dependent on awareness, perception, and reaction. By shaping the victim's routine and establishing presence, the man had removed the conditions under which resistance could arise. The victim had not been prevented from resisting. He had never been placed in a position to recognize the need to do so. Recognition requires disruption. There had been none. Blackwood understood that the case had now revealed the underlying principle that had guided its construction. It had not been built upon complexity, but upon reduction. Each step had simplified the structure, narrowing the range of possible outcomes until the final sequence required no adjustment, no correction, and no intervention. This was not an act executed at a single moment. It was a system completed over time. He remained still, allowing the full clarity of this understanding to settle. The man had not relied on speed, strength, or concealment. He had relied on the quiet removal of everything that might interfere. In doing so, he had created a structure that could be described in advance, not because it was known in the future, but because it had already been fixed in the present. What remained now was not to discover additional variables, but to trace the process by which they had been removed. Because even the most precise system leaves behind a record of its own simplification, not in what it shows, but in what it no longer contains. And within that absence, the origin of control can always be found. There are moments in an investigation when the role of the individual begins to dissolve, and what remains is the structure they have created. Blackwood understood that the sequence he had been following no longer depended on the continued presence of the man who had set it in motion. That presence had been necessary during the early stages, when observation was required, when familiarity had to be established, and when routine had to be shaped with care. But once the system had reached completion, the man himself had become unnecessary to its operation. A system, once stabilized, continues without guidance. This was the point at which the case revealed its final layer of precision. The man had not intended to act at the moment of the crime. He had intended for the conditions to act in his place. The sequence had been constructed so completely that it no longer required intervention. It would unfold as a consequence of what had already been arranged. Blackwood allowed this realization to settle before continuing his reconstruction. The absence of disturbance, the lack of visible intrusion, and the complete alignment between description and outcome all pointed toward the same conclusion. The act had not been performed through sudden action, but through delayed consequence. The man had not needed to be present when the event occurred. He had needed only to ensure that when the moment arrived, nothing would prevent it. This distinction altered the entire structure of the case. It removed the assumption that the crime had required direct execution at the time it took place. It suggested instead that the act had been initiated earlier, embedded within the routine itself, and allowed to complete its course without further influence. Blackwood considered how such a process might have been achieved. A system of this kind would require the introduction of a condition that remained inactive until a specific moment. That condition would need to exist within the environment without drawing attention, and it would need to align with the established routine in such a way that its activation would appear natural, or at least unremarkable. Such conditions do not require complexity. They require timing. The fixed point of 14 minutes past 2 now took on additional meaning. It was not only the moment at which the act occurred, but the moment at which the system completed itself. The victim's routine ensured his position. The environment ensured the absence of interference. And the condition, once introduced, required only time to reach its conclusion. Time, in this case, had not been an external factor. It had been part of the mechanism. Blackwood allowed his thoughts to move carefully through the implications of this structure. The man's certainty had not depended on his ability to act at a precise moment. It had depended on his ability to act earlier, with enough precision that the outcome would not require further adjustment. His visit to the station had not been a risk because his presence was no longer necessary. He had already completed his role. This was why the description had carried no urgency. There had been nothing left to influence. The sequence had been sealed. The man had not needed to remain hidden near the residence, nor had he needed to return at the critical moment. The system itself ensured completion. Blackwood returned in thought to the victim's final position, considering how naturally it had aligned with the described outcome. There had been no movement that suggested reaction, no indication that the moment had introduced awareness. This absence suggested that the transition from routine to event had occurred without interruption. Interruption requires presence. There had been none. The environment had remained unchanged because the act had not been introduced as an external force. It had emerged from within the existing structure, completing a process that had already begun. Blackwood understood now that the man had constructed not a single action, but a sequence that extended across time. The initial stage had involved observation and integration. The second had involved gradual adjustment of routine. The third had involved the introduction of a condition that would remain dormant until the correct moment. And the final stage had required nothing at all. Completion had been inevitable. He remained still, allowing the full clarity of this understanding to settle. The case had moved beyond the idea of a crime committed at a specific moment. It had become the study of a system designed to produce an outcome without requiring presence at the point of execution. This was the reason the man had been able to speak with such certainty. He had not been predicting what he would do. He had been describing what he had already done. Blackwood recognized that this realization resolved the apparent contradiction at the center of the case. The inversion of time, the description preceding the event, the absence of direct action, all of these were no longer anomalies. They were consequences of a structure that had been completed before it revealed itself. The future had not been known. It had been set. What remained now was to trace the origin of the condition that had allowed the system to complete itself. Because even the most precise sequence must begin with a single, deliberate act, introduced quietly into the flow of routine, and left there to unfold without interruption. And within that first act, the final answer would be found. There are elements within a system that do not act immediately and yet determine its final outcome with greater certainty than anything introduced at the moment of completion. Blackwood understood that the sequence he had reconstructed could not exist without such an element. The absence of presence at the time of the act, the lack of disturbance within the environment, and the precision with which the event had aligned with its description all pointed toward a condition that had been introduced earlier and allowed to remain unseen until the exact moment it was required. A condition of this kind does not reveal itself through action. It reveals itself through timing. Blackwood returned his attention to the structure of the residence, allowing each detail to settle into its place within the broader sequence. The room had remained undisturbed. The arrangement of objects had not been altered in any visible way. There had been no indication that anything new had been introduced immediately prior to the event. This suggested that whatever had made the act possible had already been present within the environment, integrated so completely that it had become part of its ordinary structure. Integration removes visibility. Visibility invites recognition. Blackwood considered how such a condition might exist without drawing attention. It would not have been something unusual in appearance. It would not have required constant interaction. It would have remained inactive, or at least unremarkable, until the precise moment at which it completed its function. Such elements exist naturally within everyday environments, overlooked because they belong to routine rather than disruption. Routine, once accepted, conceals detail. Blackwood allowed this thought to expand. The man had not needed to introduce complexity. Complexity increases risk. It introduces variables that cannot always be controlled. Instead, he would have selected something simple, something stable, something that could remain unchanged over time. Stability ensures that the condition once placed does not require adjustment. Adjustment introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty undermines control. He returned again to the timing of the event, recognizing that the condition must have been linked to it, not directly, but through alignment with the victim's routine. The moment of 14 minutes past 2 had not been chosen arbitrarily. It represented a point at which the environment reached its lowest level of awareness. The victim would have been in a state of reduced responsiveness. The surroundings would have remained quiet. External interference would have been minimal. Such a moment does not activate a condition. It allows it to complete itself. Blackwood understood now that the condition had not been triggered by sudden action. It had progressed gradually, moving toward completion within the boundaries of routine. Its presence would not have altered behavior. It would not have required attention. It would have existed alongside the victim's habits, carried forward by repetition until it reached the point at which it could no longer remain inactive. This progression required time. Time, once introduced into a system, becomes part of its structure. Blackwood allowed his thoughts to move carefully through this realization. The man had not needed to return to the residence at the moment of the act because the condition itself had already been set in motion. His role had ended when the system reached stability. From that point forward, the outcome no longer depended on intervention. Intervention belongs to incomplete systems. This system had been complete. Blackwood considered once more the man's calm description at the station. The absence of urgency, the clarity of detail, and the lack of hesitation all now aligned with this understanding. He had not been describing something he intended to do. He had been describing something that was already progressing toward its conclusion. The act had not been waiting. It had been unfolding. Blackwood remained still for a moment, allowing the full structure of the case to settle into clarity. The presence had established familiarity. The routine had been shaped into predictability. Time had been identified as a fixed point, and the condition had been introduced quietly, without disruption, and left to complete itself. Each element had depended on the others. Together, they had created inevitability. What remained now was to identify the nature of the condition itself, not in terms of its exact form, but in terms of its function within the sequence. It had to be something that could exist without attention, progress without intervention, and complete its effect without altering the surrounding environment in a way that would attract notice. Such conditions are rarely extraordinary. They are ordinary elements, placed with intention. Blackwood understood that the final answer would not lie in something unusual, but in something overlooked. The system had not been constructed from complexity. It had been constructed from simplicity, arranged with such precision that its outcome could be known in advance. And within that simplicity, there remained a single detail, quiet and easily ignored, that had carried the entire sequence forward from beginning to end without ever revealing itself until it was too late to change what it had already set in motion. There are elements within a system that do not depend on motion, force, or presence, and yet determine its final outcome with complete certainty. Blackwood understood that the condition he had traced through the structure of the case could not be something that demanded constant interaction or precise timing at the moment of execution. It had to be something that, once introduced, required nothing further. It had to exist quietly, progress without interference, and complete its function without announcing itself. A condition that requires nothing cannot fail through absence. Blackwood returned his attention to the environment of the residence, not to search for what had been added, but to understand what had remained. The room had preserved its structure. The objects within it had not been displaced. The sequence of the event had unfolded without visible disturbance. These details did not suggest concealment. They suggested that the condition had belonged to the environment itself. Belonging removes suspicion. Suspicion arises from difference. Blackwood allowed this distinction to guide his reasoning. The man had not introduced something foreign into the space. He had selected something already present, something that did not alter the appearance of the room when it was placed or adjusted. The condition had not drawn attention because it had not appeared as change. Change invites observation. Absence of change preserves invisibility. He considered how such an element might function within the structure he had already reconstructed. It would need to align with time without requiring activation. It would need to exist within the victim's routine without altering behavior. It would need to progress toward its outcome without introducing disturbance. Such an element does not operate through action. It operates through inevitability. Blackwood returned once more to the moment of 14 minutes past 2, recognizing that this time had not initiated the condition, but had marked its completion. The event had not begun at that moment. It had reached its conclusion there. Everything that had made it possible had occurred earlier, quietly, without interruption. Completion does not require presence. It requires preparation. Blackwood allowed the full implication of this understanding to settle. The man had not needed to be near the residence when the event occurred because the condition itself had already been embedded within the environment. Its progression had been governed not by external action, but by the internal structure of what had been placed. Structure determines outcome. Outcome follows without resistance. He considered how the victim's routine had supported this progression. The predictability of movement, the consistency of environment, and the absence of interruption had all allowed the condition to remain undisturbed. Nothing had interfered with its development. Nothing had altered its course. Interference is the only threat to inevitability. Its absence ensures completion. Blackwood understood now that the element in question had not been hidden in the traditional sense. It had not required concealment because it had not appeared unusual. It had existed openly, within the boundaries of normal perception, overlooked not because it was invisible, but because it did not demand attention. Attention is drawn to what changes. This had not changed. He allowed this realization to deepen. The system had been constructed with such restraint that it relied entirely on what was already present. The man had not needed to introduce complexity because complexity increases risk. Instead, he had relied on simplicity, selecting an element that would behave consistently over time and would not require adjustment once placed. Consistency removes uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only source of failure. Blackwood returned again to the man's statement at the station, recognizing that its certainty had been rooted in this simplicity. There had been no need for contingency, no need for correction, no need for intervention. The condition, once established, would carry itself forward to its conclusion. This was why the description had been possible. Not because the future had been known, but because it had been secured. Blackwood remained still for a moment, allowing the final structure of the case to come into focus. The presence had allowed observation. The routine had allowed predictability. Time had provided a fixed point. And the element, once introduced, had required nothing further. Together, they had formed a system that could not deviate. What remained now was not to search for complexity, but to identify the simple element that had made the entire sequence possible. It would not be extraordinary. It would not stand out. It would exist within the ordinary structure of the room, unnoticed until examined with the clarity that comes only after understanding the pattern it had served. And once identified, it would reveal not only how the event had occurred, but how it had been made certain long before the moment at which it appeared to take place. There are details within any environment that remain unnoticed not because they are hidden, but because they are constant. Blackwood understood that the final element of the sequence would not present itself as something newly introduced, nor as something that required explanation at first glance. It would exist within the ordinary structure of the room, accepted without question, repeated without thought, and therefore removed from attention. Constancy does not attract observation. It dissolves into background. Blackwood returned his attention once more to the interior of the residence, allowing the known elements to arrange themselves into a coherent structure. The room had not been altered. The objects within it had not been disturbed. There had been no visible trace of intrusion, and no sign that anything had been added or removed at the moment of the act. These absences did not obscure the truth. They defined its boundaries. Within those boundaries, the answer could not be external. It had to be internal. Blackwood considered how the environment itself might contain the condition he had been tracing. It would not be something that required concealment, because concealment introduces risk. It would not be something that depended on complexity, because complexity introduces variation. Instead, it would be something simple, stable, and integrated into the routine of the space. Simplicity ensures reliability. Reliability ensures inevitability. He allowed his thoughts to settle on the nature of such an element. It would be present not only at the moment of the act, but long before it. It would exist as part of the room's normal function, not as an anomaly. It would not draw attention because it would not differ from expectation. It would be used regularly, encountered repeatedly, and therefore never examined closely. Repetition removes scrutiny. Blackwood returned again to the sequence he had reconstructed, aligning each component with this understanding. The presence had allowed the man to observe without suspicion. The routine had provided predictability. Time had created a fixed point, and the condition had progressed without interruption, embedded within the environment itself. The final detail, therefore, could not exist outside this structure. It had to belong to it. Blackwood considered how such an element might operate within the limits of the system. It would not act suddenly. It would not require activation at a specific moment. Instead, it would progress gradually, its effect accumulating over time, unnoticed because it aligned with the natural flow of routine. Time would not trigger it. Time would reveal it. This distinction carried quiet significance. The event had not begun at 14 minutes past 2. That moment had marked the point at which the process reached completion. Everything that had made it possible had occurred earlier, within the unnoticed repetition of ordinary actions. Blackwood understood now that the victim had not encountered something unfamiliar. He had encountered something he had always known. Familiarity, when absolute, becomes invisible. He allowed this realization to deepen, recognizing that the system had relied not on deception, but on acceptance. The element had not needed to be hidden because it had never been questioned. It had existed within the environment, part of its structure, part of its routine, and therefore beyond examination. The man had not introduced a foreign object. He had altered the meaning of an existing one. Meaning, once changed, does not reveal itself immediately. It continues as before until its effect becomes unavoidable. Blackwood remained still, allowing the final alignment to form within his thoughts. The element, whatever its exact form, had been present from the beginning. It had been encountered daily, used without hesitation, and accepted without analysis. Its function had not appeared to change, but its effect had been redirected, gradually, until it produced an outcome that could not be prevented. This was the final act of control. Not to add something new, but to redefine something familiar. Blackwood understood now that the resolution of the case would not come from discovering an anomaly, but from recognizing the significance of what had always been there. The answer had not been hidden. It had been overlooked. And once seen clearly, it would reveal not only how the event had occurred, but how it had been allowed to occur, quietly, inevitably, and without interruption, within the ordinary structure of a life that had never realized it was being shaped toward a conclusion already set in motion long before the final moment arrived. There are moments in an investigation when nothing new is added, and yet everything changes. Blackwood understood that the final stage of the case did not require discovery in the traditional sense. The elements had already been identified. The structure had already been revealed. What remained was not to find something hidden, but to understand how something familiar had been altered without appearing to change at all. Alteration, when subtle, does not draw attention. It redefines without announcing itself. Blackwood returned once more to the room, not as a place where something had happened, but as a place where something had always been present. The objects within it had not shifted. Their positions had remained constant. Their appearance had offered no reason for concern. And yet within that constancy, there had been a single detail whose function had been changed so gradually that it had escaped notice entirely. Function, once assumed, is rarely questioned. Blackwood allowed this principle to guide his reasoning. The victim had interacted with his environment through habit, not examination. Each object within the room had carried a purpose that had been accepted long before the sequence began. That purpose had remained stable in appearance, even as its effect had been quietly redirected. This redirection had not required force. It had required patience. Blackwood considered how such a change might have been introduced. It would not have been immediate. A sudden alteration invites attention. Instead, it would have been gradual, aligned with routine, introduced in increments small enough to remain unnoticed. Over time, the difference between what was and what had become would dissolve, leaving only the new function, accepted as though it had always existed. Gradual change becomes invisible. Invisibility ensures continuation. He returned again to the structure of the sequence, aligning this understanding with the elements already established. The presence had allowed access. The routine had allowed predictability. Time had provided the fixed point. And the element within the room had carried the process forward, not through action, but through quiet transformation. Transformation does not need to be seen to be complete. Blackwood allowed his thoughts to settle on the moment of 14 minutes past 2, recognizing now that it had not marked the beginning of the event, nor even its progression, but its conclusion. By that moment, the change had already reached its final stage. Nothing remained to be introduced. Nothing remained to be adjusted. The outcome had not been triggered. It had been revealed. This distinction carried the final clarity the case required. The man had not needed to act at the moment of completion because his action had occurred earlier, within the gradual redefinition of something the victim had trusted without question. The system had not relied on concealment. It had relied on assumption. Assumption, once established, resists examination. Blackwood understood that the victim had not encountered an unfamiliar condition. He had continued to interact with his environment exactly as he always had. The only difference had been the meaning of that interaction, altered slowly until it produced a result that could not be recognized until it was complete. Recognition comes too late when change is gradual. He remained still for a moment, allowing the full structure to settle into place. The case no longer presented itself as a sequence of separate elements, but as a single, continuous process. The man had not created something new. He had reshaped what already existed, guiding it toward a different outcome without ever breaking its continuity. Continuity had been preserved. Meaning had been changed. Blackwood understood now that the final answer lay not in identifying an object, but in understanding its transformation. The element within the room had not drawn attention because it had never appeared to change. It had remained constant in form, constant in presence, and constant in use. Only its effect had been altered, and that alteration had been enough to determine the entire outcome. The man had not needed to hide what he had done. He had needed only to ensure that it would not be recognized. Blackwood allowed the thought to settle with quiet certainty. The case had reached its conclusion not through discovery, but through recognition. The structure had been there from the beginning, waiting to be seen as it truly was, rather than as it had been made to appear. And once seen clearly, it could no longer remain concealed. Only one step remained, to bring that clarity into the open, and to restore the simple truth that had been obscured by the quiet precision of a system designed to appear more complex than it had ever been. There are cases that seem to invite complexity, and others that quietly resist it. Blackwood understood, as the final structure of this investigation settled into clarity, that what had appeared at first to be an inversion of time, a contradiction of logic, and a disturbance in the natural order of cause and effect, had in fact been none of these things. The case had never required mystery. It had required patience. What had been presented as something extraordinary had always belonged to the ordinary. Blackwood returned one final time, in thought, to the room itself, not as a place of consequence, but as a place of continuity. Nothing within it had ever appeared out of place. The objects had remained where they were expected to be. Their presence had never been questioned, and their function had never been examined beyond what routine required. It was within this quiet certainty that the truth had remained concealed, not hidden, accepted. The element that had carried the entire sequence forward had not been something introduced to the environment, but something that had always existed within it. It had been part of the room, part of the victim's daily life, and part of a routine that had never demanded attention. Its presence had been constant. Its use had been repeated. And because of this, it had passed beyond scrutiny. Blackwood understood now that the man had not needed to create anything new. He had needed only to observe what was already there, to understand its role within the structure of the victim's life, and to alter that role with such care that the change would never be noticed. The method had been simple: a gradual adjustment, a subtle redefinition. An element once harmless had been guided, over time, toward a different function. Its appearance had not changed. Its presence had not changed. Only its effect had been redirected, slowly, precisely, and without interruption. The victim had continued to interact with it as he always had. There had been no reason not to. Routine does not question itself. Blackwood allowed this realization to settle fully. The event that had taken place at 14 minutes past 2 had not been an isolated act. It had been the final point in a process that had begun long before that night, carried forward by repetition, and completed without the need for presence or intervention. The man had not been there. He had not needed to be. He had completed his work earlier, when he had reshaped something familiar into something inevitable. By the time the moment arrived, the system required nothing further. It moved toward its conclusion as naturally as routine itself. This was why he had been able to describe it. Not because he had seen the future, but because he had removed every possibility that could have led to a different outcome. Blackwood remained still, recognizing that the apparent mystery had never existed in the way it had first appeared. The inversion of sequence had been an illusion, created by the deliberate act of revealing the outcome before it occurred. That act had shifted attention away from the present, away from the structure that had made the event possible, and toward the question of how it could be known in advance. And in doing so, it had concealed the simplicity of the truth. Simplicity, when surrounded by confusion, becomes invisible. Blackwood understood that the resolution of the case did not lie in uncovering something hidden, but in restoring clarity. The man had not relied on impossibility. He had relied on understanding, of routine, of presence, of time, and of the quiet ways in which ordinary elements can be guided toward extraordinary outcomes when left unquestioned. The system had been precise. The outcome had been inevitable. And the explanation had always been present. The man, once found, would not be defined by unpredictability, but by patience. His actions would not reveal brilliance through complexity, but through restraint. He had not acted in a moment. He had acted across time, allowing each small adjustment to settle until nothing remained uncertain. Blackwood allowed the final thought to come to rest with quiet certainty. There had been no mystery, only structure. And structure, once understood, leaves nothing unresolved. The night returned to stillness, as it always does, carrying with it the quiet sense that even the most intricate patterns, when observed with care, reveal themselves not as puzzles beyond comprehension, but as simple arrangements waiting to be seen clearly. And somewhere, within that stillness, another pattern was already forming, unnoticed, patient, and precise. If this quiet mystery held your attention, consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your presence helps bring the next case of Detective Blackwood to life and ensures that no story remains unheard in the quiet hours of the night.